So I'm going to start with a little bit of an introduction about myself, just so you have a better understanding of who I am, why I'm here today. This session, it really is going to be sort of generalized information because I know autism is a broad spectrum and there are a lot of different people here with a lot of different children with a lot of different needs. And so to be able to provide that very personalized information is more of like a one-on-one type consultation that you might have with a provider. This is really to give a nice, hopefully helpful overview of autism so that you're able to start that journey that you may have. So my name is Nathan Morgan. I'm a licensed social worker. I've been practicing social work for the better part of a decade. I actually started with an internship at an organization called Milestones Autism Resources. Milestones Autism Resources is a nonprofit in Northeast Ohio that provides training to professionals about how to support individuals who are on the autism spectrum, provides free help desk services to help connect people to various resources related to autism, has a conference where autism is discussed as a major topic of interest, and those types of things. So I started my professional internship in the autism field. Then I transitioned over to an organization that's actually right nearby, right down the street, Achievement Centers for Children. While I was there, I worked as a childhood mental health therapist. I did that for about 2 years. And then a little bit of like PRN work on the side there. Milestones had created some early intervention related services. And so I was scouted to sort of take over some of that stuff. I started as a coordinator, became a manager. We developed something what we called the Autistic Supports Department, which was really focused on advocacy for individuals who are on the autism spectrum, as well as increasing awareness about accessibility and those types of matters. I now act as director for that Autistic Supports Department, so I'm no longer working in the help desk. I don't know if I've ever worked with any of you at any point through the help desk, but if I did, hopefully it was a pleasant experience. But more so now, I'm doing a little less one-on-one with families and more so trying to do the broader advocacy, hoping that the experiences that you may have or your children may have will be as accessible as possible. I'm also, in addition to being a licensed social worker, I'm also an autistic individual myself. I was diagnosed when I was a kid. I went through a great deal of speech therapy for some of my communication difficulties that I had. I went through occupational therapy. I'm just going to say, well, I'm a social worker. In a different life, I probably would have been an OT because it's the most enjoyable therapy I've ever had. I also went through physical therapy because sometimes kids on the autism spectrum may have unusual gait, which is the way that we walk, or those types of things. So I've gone through a whole range of different therapies. So I come to this topic both as a professional with years of experience and knowledge, but also lived experience. So when I'm presenting, when I'm sharing about autism, I tend to juggle between different hats. If I am speaking from a professional lens, I'll usually say as a social worker, this is my recommendation or advice. Or I might say as an autistic individual, because sometimes there's an overlap between the two, but sometimes there's not. And so it's really important that I maintain that scope of practice so that I'm not advising in like a professional way when really I'm speaking my own personal opinion, more so my professional opinion. With that being said, I'm going to move us into the topic area, starting with autism prevalence. Just by a show of hands here, how many have a child who's diagnosed with autism formally, or a grandchild, or a cousin, or a sibling, or someone? Just like by a show of hands, pretty much everyone in this room. So I guess I'm in a good audience here. The autism prevalence rate has actually gone up quite a bit. You'll see this trend here in 20, is my laser pointer's not being agreeable. I'm not finding it. It's probably up there somewhere. But, 1 in 66 way back in 2004. That was the number of kids identified. We had a huge surge of people being identified in the 80s, the 90s. That was the generation that I'm from. Sometimes we refer to ourselves colloquially in some autism spaces as first generation autistics. We know that there were others before us, but there was this huge surge in diagnosis in the 80s and 90s. But then we saw a huge increase up to the point that we are now, 1 in 44 at the end there. But the most recent number is 1 in 36 of kiddos who are identified as being on the autism spectrum. The reason for this is, well, there are a couple. proposed reasons. The first, actually, I'm going to jump to this one. We have much better diagnostic information available. Many more professionals are aware of the variance in autism. Many more professionals are seeing it regularly. It used to be that you would have to go to a very highly specialized clinic that was like 6 states away to get an autism diagnosis. I was living in Grand Junction, Colorado when I was diagnosed, and I remember we would have to go trip after trip through the Rocky Mountains all the way to Denver. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with Colorado geography, but that's quite a trek, especially in the winter with all of the snow falling in the mountains. Um, we have a lot more effort and attention paid towards screening. So that's a big thing as well. When you're going to school, when you're in your pediatrician's office, those kinds of conversations are happening at a younger age, and they're much more in depth, so that those early intervention opportunities are much more available. We have a much better identification in girls and children of color. There are a lot of implicit biases in the system. A lot of the research that exists about autism was really normed on little boys. So a lot of times little girls weren't identified because it can present a little bit differently. There are different social factors and those types of things that can really contribute to diagnosis. I'd be happy to explore that maybe in the Q&A section if those types of questions come up. And we also saw that like children of color might be misdiagnosed with something like oppositional defiant disorder or intermittent explosive disorder because there were those implicit biases that were sort of those assumptions made about why a child is behaving in a specific way. So that had helped. But we're also seeing, and I know that this sounds ridiculous given that a lot of the waiting lists are still 2 and 3 years long, depending on where you live geographically. I've even heard of some people waiting 4 years for a diagnosis. The waiting lists are actually decreasing because there are many more providers. So it's still a long wait, but it's a shorter wait. So we know that this 1 in 36 is what's accurately, or that's sort of reflected right now, but the numbers are actually probably much higher for rates of autism diagnosis than we're aware of. There are some changes in diagnostic guidelines. It used to be that there was Asperger's was a separate category. The DSM-5 is the diagnostic tool that we use for autism that basically made autism like this umbrella term. So there was previously pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, Asperger's. You may still hear older individuals who are diagnosed with autism describe their autism in that way, and that's okay. There's just been that changing in language. It's now just all autism because we've recognized that even though the symptom presentation may be a bit different from person to person, the underlying mechanisms behind the traits are still very much similar. We also know that there could be potential biological factors. So oftentimes, and I'll get to this a little bit later in the presentation, there is this likelihood of genetic heritability where it can run in families, and we can see some degree of that. And then also as parents are older, waiting longer to have kids, and then also with general health, body weight, those types of factors can contribute to autism diagnoses as well. So there are a variety of reasons why the autism rates are increasing. Just noting, though, that the science is very clear that it's not due to vaccines. It's not due to, there are a lot of myths about what causes autism out there. And we are pretty clear that there are a lot of things that aren't really contributing factors. We've ruled a lot of those out. The early 2000s in particular for autism, it was like the Wild West. So much was unknown about it. The internet was still relatively young in its infancy. A lot of information spread like wildfire, and we still have some of that misinformation popping up today. So at the end of the presentation, we'll also talk a little bit about how to review information, because I want everyone here to feel empowered to be able to have the most accurate information possible. I am going to share about autism from the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network's definition, description of autism. I think a lot of us are probably familiar with the DSM, that medical model kind of diagnosis about impairments in communication and those types of things. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network is a group that is organized by individuals who are on the autism spectrum who are involved in policy advocacy, trying to help change the laws of the country, trying to make insurance and other things more accessible for individuals who are on the autism spectrum. And this is what they piece together for their definition of autism, that it's a developmental disability that affects how we experience the world around us. It's a normal part of life, and it makes us who we are. So, as autistic people, speaking as an autistic adult, there are certain aspects of my autistic identity that I can't separate from who I am. Like, if I were to change those aspects of myself, I would fundamentally change who I am as a person. That being said, it's not without struggles. You know, there certainly are some difficulties that can exist. There's no one way to be autistic. Um, every single individual in this room, we have lots of people raise their hands. You have grandkids, you have your own kids. Um, your experiences, your child's experiences, grandchild's experiences are going to be different maybe than the person sitting next to you's child, grandchild, etc. Some of us are highly communicative with our spoken language. Others of us use communication devices. Some of us may fluctuate between those. I know plenty of individuals who are on the autism spectrum who can communicate through spoken language, but choose to communicate through a tablet or another assistive communication device because it's more accessible for them as a person. It makes communication easier and less cumbersome for them. Some individuals who are autistic have intellectual disabilities, and some people don't. Some need a lot of help in day-to-day lives, and I'm sure that there are a lot of parents and grandparents here who can recognize that, and some may not need as much. And so we want to be very careful that when we're speaking about autism, we're reflecting that whole variance there. And also, we used to use terms like functioning labels. We used to say an individual was high functioning or low functioning. But that's kind of a mischaracterization. If an individual is highly supported, even if they have communication difficulties, intellectual disabilities, they can live very happy and fulfilling lives. On the other hand, even if an individual is highly communicative, if they don't have that robust support that they need, they may struggle with employment, they may struggle to make friends. So those functioning labels can seem like it's a nice, easy classification, but it's much more complex than that. And we'll get to that on another slide as well. What you might find is that autistic people, we think differently. A lot of us are interested in patterns, routines, repetition. Some of your children may like to organize things. Some of your kids may be complete messes, like throwing everything everywhere. So we're not all one size fits all. We're all very different, diverse people. We process things differently. Some of us are highly sensitive to the sensory stimuli around us, the lights, the noise, taste, texture. You might find that your kid wants to eat nothing but plain mashed potatoes just because that's the only thing that it's like low flavor, low texture. But then you might find the other kid who really wants to eat really spicy, like Indian curry with like lots of crunchy bits or something in it. So there's that sensory seeking behavior and sensory avoiding. And someone can be both. So you can have sensory avoiding with regards to lights and sounds, where you want to get away from bright, loud places, but you may want to have a lot of tactile stimulation. You want to have like a really itchy sweater on. So there is that variance that we have. Every single person is going to have a different sensory profile. We kind of talked a little bit about the communicating differently. Some people will use sign language. Some people will gesture to charts. Some people will use spoken communication. Some people will use written communication. And there are a wide range of other ways of communicating. Can't possibly cover all of them tonight. But we'll also see some differences in socialization. Sometimes autistic people, we may take things very literally. Other times we're very creative and we understand all sorts of philosophy and those types of things. I've met so many neurodivergent poets and other people who have a great mastery of words. So while we can sometimes stereotype autism, we want to be careful that we're really thinking about each individual child and each individual adult. I know that our audience here is children, but children grow up to be adults. So we want to make sure that we're not creating stereotypes where there's that. Eye contact does tend to be a really big area as well. There's a lot of sensory information that's conveyed. We could get into mirror neurons and all sorts of other stuff, but that's just way too advanced for what we're doing here tonight. But there are sorts of reasons why eye contact can be really difficult. Um, but also, just being aware that um, if it's not a health and safety concern, sometimes it's okay for there to be difference. So that's really, I think, what we're going to talk about today as well, is trying to help kind of gauge when and where interventions and those kinds of things can make the most sense. We had some questions about, you get these big lists from after a diagnosis. How do you make sense of a diagnosis after that? But this, just ending on one note from them, not every autistic person will relate to all of the things that shared here today. Um, there are lots of different ways, and that's okay. So, if your experiences as a parent or if you're an individual differ from what's described here, feel free to speak up and share about your experiences, because, I can share from my own lived experiences. I can share about the experiences of the clients that I have. But really, the greatest way of having us all together, one of the purposes of having us all together, is to be able to share that information and support each other. Connecting for Kids is a great organization to really be able to help build those connections. As I kind of noted earlier, we used to think of autism as sort of a linear spectrum where you're either like slightly autistic or high functioning, or you're very autistic and low functioning. Um, but it is a lot more complex than that. This isn't my sensory profile, but you'll see this is more so when we're thinking about and conceptualizing autism nowadays, is we're thinking of it more like this kind of a chart. I happen to have, pretty high language skills. So that's not an area that I'd struggle a lot with. I did when I was younger, but nowadays not so much. But with my sensory, I struggle quite a lot. I do have my own independent living space. And I have a perfectly like climate controlled, sensory controlled environment, because otherwise I struggle. I've been very happy after the pandemic of being able to work remotely a lot of the time, because it's meant I've had a better level of control over my sensory environment. So motor skills, I have terrible gross motor skills. My fine motor skills are getting better, but all of us, your children are all going to have different sensory profiles. So when you're thinking about your children's needs, think about it in that way. Think about, they're really doing great in this area, but there are some struggles over here. So how can we build up some of these skills in this other area? And that might help you prioritize what services and interventions you want to pursue through some of that list. This is a great quote by Dr. Stephen Shore. That's, if you've met one person with autism, you've met only one person with autism. That's, again, just restating that there's so much variance in our community. So you've probably heard me say autistic person a lot. And for some of you, maybe you recoiled at hearing that. Others maybe are aware of sort of where that comes from. In the autism community, we have two different ways of speaking about autism. We use identity first language. This is what my organization, Milestones, uses. But then we also have person first language, which is like what the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities uses. And there's a reason for both, and there's a rich history and a rich culture there. Really, what we saw happen was that person first language, as in person with autism, person with anxiety, person with this condition or that condition, really came about because for the longest time in the history in the United States, we viewed individuals with disabilities as subhuman. We looked at them as a burden on our society. We put them in institutions. We kept them away from society. There was a lot of stigma. And so the person first language approach really came about because we were trying to, disability advocates, were really trying to encourage the broader community to think about people with disabilities as human beings worthy of dignity and respect, because that was something that wasn't afforded to us, in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and even prior to that. I was going to ask a question, but I think I'll just explain it. So the identity first language is very similar to what we also see with the deaf community. Some of you may be aware that the deaf community has a huge culture surrounding it. It's language, symbols, community. And so from that, the deaf community prefers identity first language. The autism community is very similar. We have a lot of individuals who are on the autism spectrum who view that parts of our autism are so integral to who we are as people, because how do we understand the world? We understand the world through what we see, through what we hear, through what we taste, what we touch, our perception, our senses. And if we were to change those aspects of our perception, our whole understanding of the world would be so fundamentally different. So a lot of times, individuals on the autism spectrum may refer to themselves as autistic person, like as an autistic person through identity first language. It is worth noting that there is no right or wrong way to do this. If you prefer one or the other, absolutely okay. So some people will say that they're people who have disabilities, neurodivergent people. There's lots of terminology that we use. All of them are all great. If you happen to be speaking with someone and you hear that they're referring to themselves in a certain way, like if someone says, "I'm a person with autism," then try to mirror that, because it's just respectful to be understanding of where someone's coming from. Or if you say, "I'm a parent of a child with autism," try to respect those other parents and their preference. Or if you hear someone say, "I'm the parent of an autistic child," try to respect that as well. Just because language doesn't work for us doesn't mean that so we want to try to find some common ground and some support there. Just noting that, because that's been one of the bigger trends we've seen within language, and you'll see it a lot in social media communities as well. And I know that a lot of people can get their information through there, so just trying to help support with navigating some of that. There is a lot of terminology about autism as well. And I know that some of this can get really confusing, so I tried to put it here. Please feel free to reference it in your PowerPoint if ever you encounter any of these terms. But as you're looking into autism on your own or in communicating with other groups, you'll see a lot of these words. Autistic is really just a person who is diagnosed with autism or may self-identify. There are reasons for why some adults may self-identify, because those waiting lists are 2 and 3 years long for little kids sometimes. Those waiting lists can be 4, 5, 6, 7 years for an adult. Services for adults are virtually non-existent. So if your child does happen to have a diagnosis already, that's great, because that will help them moving forward. Allistic is really just the opposite of autistic. So that's like a non-autistic person. Neurodivergent is another big word we have out there. Sometimes people will think neurodivergent is a synonym for autistic. It's not necessarily. So neurodivergent is a broader category. It means that someone's not of the prevailing neurotype. That can include, if any of you have kids who have ADHD, people who have schizophrenia. Basically, if your brain is working in a different way than the majority, likely neurodivergent. On the other hand, neurotypical refers to pretty much, sometimes people will say normal or regular, but normal and regular can be very stigmatizing words and can really sound like kids who aren't that are inferior or subhuman in some way. So we really want to be careful how we're referring to people, because of the effects that it can have on our children's self-esteem, self-worth, feeling like they're being othered or mistreated compared to some of their peers. Neurodiversity is this big word. You'll hear it a lot. It's almost become like a buzzword, but it is a really important concept. Whether you're autistic or allistic, whether you're neurodivergent or neurotypical, every single person in this room has different, neurology. We're different, we have different perceptions. Looking at the person next to you, you probably like different foods. You probably like different fragrances if you're wearing perfume. You might like different types of clothing and those types of things because the way it feels on you. Neurodiversity is really just recognizing that all of us are different and we need to make concessions to really, it's part of this social contract. As being people who live in society, we have to recognize that the people around us are different and maybe coming from different backgrounds. And neuroaffirming, on the other hand, is this idea that no singular way of being is inherently superior to another. So if you have a child who's neurodivergent, your child is not an inferior person. Your child may have different strengths and struggles, but so does every other person in this room. So that's just one of those really important concepts to keep in mind. We do try to pay particular attention to individuals who are neurodivergent, because the society that we live in may not be structured in a way that inherently supports that group, but that doesn't mean that supporting everyone is not being considered in a lot of those reflections on what's neuroaffirming. So I'm going to pause there just for a second to get a drink because my mouth is a little dry. Um, but then I'll get us into some steps preceding a diagnosis. So I know everyone pretty much everyone raised their hands here, indicating that you have a child who's autistic. Um, does your child currently have a diagnosis, just by a show of hands, or are you waiting for a diagnosis? Has a diagnosis? Okay, so we're actually really lucky. This is actually kind of exciting. I was expecting more of a 50-50. So some of this stuff may not be as relevant, but I'll still share it because we have some people on camera here as well. Um, and some of the information may apply if you have friends or other people who are seeking a diagnosis, etc. Perhaps one of the greatest things you can do early on, and I found my clicker. Okay, connect with early intervention services. So again, another show of hands. Thank you for being helpful. Did anyone in this room, just by a show of hands, access services through like Connecting for Kids or Bright Beginnings? A little less than half, maybe. So the great thing about those services, while it's not necessarily applicable to anyone whose child might be over the age of 3, is that these are free services that you can access if you identify that there's maybe a delay in development or something that you might need some support with. And it can be a great way to get that start on getting services even before a formal diagnosis takes place. But even if you did miss out on that window for Bright Beginnings and Help Me Grow, you can still access therapies even without a formal diagnosis of autism because there are other diagnosis categories that exist out there. I can say when I was working at achievement centers, a lot of times the speech therapists there would use different codes to be able to bill for those types of services. Finding what those areas are that a child is maybe struggling with some delays or some areas of need, there are roundabout ways of doing that. Um, Connecting for Kids and Milestones and other organizations can help connect you with therapists who are able to help support you with navigating those kinds of discussions. I'm not able to give any specific advice because I'm not working as your therapist or anything like that. So I want to be really mindful of my scope of practice. But I do want to note that if you identify any other need that you have, there can be some creative solutions to getting some support. You just might need someone who has experience in helping you navigate those. Locating your trusted partners and sources of information. This is perhaps the biggest, most important piece. Because when you are approaching a diagnosis, whether you have it or you're waiting for it, it can be a really confusing, overwhelming process. There's lots of information online. You may hear stories from some parents that make you feel very fearful for the future about your child or your loved one's development. You may see things on television that mischaracterize autism. A lot of the representation that we have in the media about autism is very misleading. And the other parts of it is it may not necessarily be personally tailored to your loved one's needs. So having trusted sources of information is really important because there's so much to wade through on there. There are lots of myths. I can tell you when I actually first started in this line of work, the types of horror stories that I learned. There's something called urine therapy, which is drinking like cow urine and those types of things to cure or treat autism. That's not an effective support for autism. People will order all sorts of exotic foods and things from far off locales that are hundreds of dollars per ounce. And those also aren't effective in supporting and treating autism. So sometimes when you're looking for information, there are people out there who try to take advantage of that for their own gain and for whatever purposes they have. Accessing school services is another big one. And I know sometimes private schools can sound really captivating because we think of private schools as maybe having very robust services, a lot of training, but there are pros and cons to the types of schools that you have. Private schools can be very selective in who they take. So if your child has very extensive disabilities, the cost may be way too excessive for the typical family to afford. Or they may reject your child for any reason. You may start with the process and they may say your child's needs are just too much and remove the child from that school setting. There are a lot of advocates in the disability community who fought for public schools and for that opportunity through IEPs. So while they're certainly not perfect and every school district is going to be varied, there are opportunities to find advocates who can help you navigate those school systems. I'm not going to tell you that it's going to be easy because I've heard some really terrible horror stories about some schools. Some schools are phenomenal and some schools just aren't. But that's where finding an advocate to be able to help as well. Public school systems also afford legal protections that private schools don't necessarily afford. So, for example, your child may be entitled to a 504 plan or an IEP. So you can access some different types of therapies through some of those programs. So uh, don't discount private schools, but also don't discount public schools. Really try to see what options are available to you and assess the pros and cons of each. Um, Especially also the costs and those types of things as well, because it can almost be like attending college. Um, but also reading about autism and be open to alternative diagnoses. Sometimes when I've worked with individuals, they may have a cousin who's on the autism spectrum. And so you may think that, well, my child must have autism because their cousin's very similar in a lot of these ways. Neurodivergence, it's a broad category. ADHD and other things can present similarly. Now, there also may be masking behavior. So it is, a really complex discussion. Weigh all of the information, piece together your reasons for why you believe your loved one may be on the autism spectrum, and be prepared to have those discussions with your providers. Since most of the people here already seem like they have a diagnosis for their loved ones, I'll probably not jump too far into that until we get maybe to the Q&A if people have those questions, just in the interest of time. Um, but steps for after a diagnosis. I only put a handful here because I figured we're going to have probably a lot more specific questions, and I wanted to really account for some of that in our time. But I'd say these are probably the main areas that I have, when I've reflected on with other parents, these are the most consistent across almost all personal backgrounds. First, explore the newly opened avenues for support. We'll talk a little bit about those lists that you get because those are a really big deal. But that's where somewhere like Connecting for Kids or Milestones may come into play, because you can have new scholarships that become available. Maybe you can access services through your county board of developmental disabilities when maybe you previously weren't eligible for those services. Maybe you can access SSI or other types of financial benefits. There might be things that are open to you now that you have a formal diagnosis. Um, but the second piece really is remembering who your child is. Your child after the diagnosis is the same child they were before. The diagnosis really just is a label that helps other people know how to support them. It didn't change anything about who they are intrinsically. I think sometimes what can happen is there can be these feelings of grief, there can be these feelings of loss, and those are perfectly okay and perfectly valid. But I try to encourage people to consider that, even though you have this information, you've probably suspected it for a while if you went through the diagnosis process. Um, but also, your child is still who they are. If you find that you need some support through that, there are some amazing therapists who can really help parents navigate those complex emotions that can sometimes come after a diagnosis. Sharing this new information with your team is also a big step, because the providers that you're working with, once they know this information, it may reconceptualize their approaches for how they're handling things. Sometimes it doesn't, because sometimes they were already working towards the developmental goals that you had in place. But sometimes it gets people thinking, like it gets the cogwheels turning. We all can benefit from prompts sometimes. And so saying, my child has a formal autism diagnosis now. What does this mean for the types of services that you can offer? What does this mean for the types of supports that are available through the school, through these therapy services, can be really important. But this last one, I don't know what's going on there. I think I clicked something and it's scrolling down. But explore a diagnosis for yourself if relevant. And so this is something that I have found really fascinating, is that a lot of times people who are seeking help desk services through like Milestones, Many of the people reaching us out to us now are adults in their 20s, in their 30s, sometimes even their 40s, 50s, and 60s. They had a loved one who was diagnosed on the autism spectrum, and while going through that process, they learned a lot about autism, about what it means, about the sensory processing, about the communication differences, and all of that. And so it really led them to think, oh, maybe I've gone this whole time with all of these areas and I've just struggled my whole life, but I could have been supported if I had this diagnosis. So that often starts a parent's journey towards an autism diagnosis. I'd say it's a huge trend right now, where it's happening. And there are a variety of emerging support groups for parents who are kind of coming into that. A lot of them are online. A lot of them started over the pandemic as well. But there are some of those kinds of options available. They do vary in quality. But if you think that you might have something, don't feel shame in it. You can actually learn a lot by kind of going through this process in tandem with your child or your grandchild. And you can learn a lot about yourself while also learning about them. Um, this is one of the last things I want to touch on before I kind of get into like the specifics of navigating the list and some of the specific questions that we might have. Is I want everyone in this room to feel like they're an informed consumer. I want you to feel like when you're looking at information about autism, you have this expertise to be able to test and check if the information is reliable or accurate. We'll see this a lot, and this isn't just in the autism field, this is across the entire like mental health, behavioral health spectrum of things, is the presence of therapy speak. Sometimes what people will use is they'll use therapeutic words in sort of the wrong way. So we see a lot online right now about like gaslighting. Gaslighting is a very specific abuse strategy. It's where someone is intentionally trying to make someone feel like they've lost their mind by repeatedly saying, no, I didn't open the window, you opened the window, even when the window has been opened by that individual. Like, and they'll do it over and over and over again, trying to make the person think that they're going crazy. This therapy speak language tends to pop up a lot in groups where an individual is trying to add a degree of expertise to what they're describing. So rather than saying this person's lying to you or this person has a difference of opinion, that sort of thing, they may try to use that because it makes their argument sound stronger. It's one of those strategies that people will use in addition to something like psychobabble. Psychobabble is really using a lot of buzzwords. Like if you hear, so I just put this one here because I actually read this on a forum of someone who was describing a pretty common behavior, and I'll explain what this is. Does anyone want to take a guess what an object personifying synesthete is? So basically, it just means that you're adding a personality or you're finding personality in an inanimate object. So for example, if you have a stuffed animal, you might say, this is my bear Teddy, and Teddy's my friend, and we like to have tea parties together, and it's great. Sometimes when autistic people are lonely, but it's also just a pretty typical childhood thing as well, adding personality to something that is inanimate is actually a pretty common trait. But this is sometimes what people will do online to try to make themselves sound maybe smarter than they are or try to sound more like an expert. It's worth noting that oftentimes clinicians, therapists, doctors, etc., we try to simplify the language that we're communicating, with parents and other people because we want the language to be understood. We want the terms to be understood. So sometimes we might accidentally throw in some complex language here and there, but ultimately our goal is to keep things as simple as possible. A great deal of time and effort goes into unlearning all of the language that we learned in college so that we're able to have conversations with average people who aren't involved in research and aren't involved in data and statistics and those types of things. So kind of noting that these two things, like you'll see your therapist is gaslighting you about your diagnosis is another example I've seen a lot online. Your therapist or your provider might have a difference of opinion. And so that's okay as well. Or they might not be taking in that data, but that therapist is not necessarily trying to abuse you. They have a difference of opinion, and I'd encourage you if you disagree with them to seek a second opinion. Sometimes that happens, and even if you do get a diagnosis, and you disagree with the diagnosis, or if you want a diagnosis but you're not getting it, in all of those instances, it's perfectly okay to get a second opinion. But with this kind of with unreliable sources, they'll try to use these types of language to try to confuse you, and then they'll try to sell you something as well. They'll try to sell you, some sort of oil or something that you can put on your kid's pillow that's going to make their autism go away, and that kind of stuff. Um, I'll kind of get to that in a second as well. But pop psychology is another thing as well. Just because you hear a lot of ideas online and you hear a lot of people repeating it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best or most appropriate intervention. I hear this so often from families. They'll hear about a specific type of service and they'll say, I want that, or my child must have this service. But that service may not be what's most appropriate for your child. And just because it's helpful for one child doesn't mean it's helpful for all children. Pop psychology is also like that really trendy psychology. You'll sometimes see that on social media, like the personality profiles and things like that. Note that a lot of those really aren't used in the way that they're used on social. They're used a lot more sparingly, and there's a lot of data about them not being as effective or reliable with regards to identifying personality. Personality is really complex, but those kinds of things you read on social media can give you these ideas that this is the way it has to be done, but don't let perfect be the enemy of good. There are some tremendous services out there. If you find something, if your provider is trying to recommend something, give it a shot. If it doesn't work, maybe you've wasted a few hours of your life that you can't get back. But try it, and ask questions. Ask lots of questions. Why are you recommending this type of intervention versus that intervention? And your provider might try to explain that. It might be that the types of providers just aren't available in the area who offer a certain intervention. Or it might be that that intervention really only works, in these very specific settings. Or there might not be a lot of replication for it. We don't really have time to talk about the replication crisis, and it's kind of outside of our scope. But basically, research is still in this complicated situation where we're trying to develop new therapeutic strategies, but until the science kind of unfolds, we're kind of delayed in some ways. So I'll just keep it kind of really simple like that. But the most important thing, though, is when you're looking at information online about autism, confirm who is making the claim. So is the person making the claim someone who is professionally licensed, or are they someone who's speaking from a lived experience background? And try to assess what that information is telling you. If someone's talking about negative experiences that they had with a service, consider that, but also consider that sometimes you can have really good experiences or really bad experiences based on a specific provider, not necessarily a whole field of services. The other thing to keep in mind is why they're making it. Just because someone is a licensed professional doesn't mean that they're not trying to sell you on something. So if someone's saying my approach to, so I'll use myself as an example. Say if I were to try to tell you that I think that social work is superior to psychology. I'm not saying that. Just I know I'm on camera. I'm not actually saying that. Don't take it out of context. But if I were to say social work is superior to psychology for supporting individuals on the autism spectrum, I'm biased in that approach because I'm a social worker. I'm trying to advance my own career. I'm trying to advance my own practice. If I owned my own nonprofit and I said, if you really want autism services, you have to come to Nathan's autism service provider place. So really try to be mindful of who is selling you the information, why they're selling you the information. It's really important to be a detective. It's a lot of work, but it can save you a lot of hardship and heartache in the long run.